Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Colin Memorial Lecture. My name is Haishan Yuan. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Economics at the University of Queensland. Before we begin, let me start with acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodialship of lands on which we meet. University of Queensland, or UQ, pay our respect to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to the country, and recognize their valuable contribution to the society. So today, we have the annual lecture in this Colin Memorial lecture series. Dr. Colin was a UQ economic academic whose work on national income accounting was fundamental importance to the development of macroeconomics and to the approach of John Maynard Keynes. So about history, while visiting Australia, he accepted the invitation of Queensland Premier Fogan Smith to work with the government. And when he reflects on the opportunity in a letter to Keynes, he wrote that the opportunity was too remarkable, an opportunity to be missed for putting economics into practice. In 1938, he was appointed government statistician, director of the Bureau of Industry and financial advisor to the Queensland Treasury, and provided the state's first set of economic accounts in 1940. Dr. Clark's greatest contribution to economics was his pioneering approach and roles in the construction of national accounts. Today, we are really excited to have Professor Jessica Pan from the National University of Singapore to give us this lecture on the evolution of gender in the labor markets. Professor Pan is Professor of Economics, Vice Provost, and Dean of NUS Graduate School. She is also a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics and the Center of Economic Policy Research. She did her undergrad degree, MBA, and PhD all at the University of Chicago. Professor Pan's research focused on applies topic in labor economics and economic of educations. She has have a number of seminal works published in leading journal economics, such as the Quality Journal of Economics, Review of Economic Studies, and her recent work focused on gender differences in labor markets and education outcomes, as well as international migrations and the labor market effects on source and host country, as well as topics in labor economics such as discrimination, the marriage market, and return to educations. She is also a fellow of the Econometric Society and the secretary of the Asians and Australasia Society of Labor Economics. So I'm really excited to learn about the contents, the material that Professor Pan is going to talk about.
Great. Welcome everyone to today's lecture. Many thanks, Haishan, for the kind introduction. It is truly my great honor to give this year's Colin Clark Memorial Lecture virtually here at the University of Queensland. And today, I think, it was very nice when Haishan kind of introduced Colin Clark's contribution as putting economics into practice. And I think one of the things that I would like to talk very much about today is really kind of, putting economics into practice and thinking about gender in the labor market. So what I'll be talking about today is thinking about how the study of gender has evolved in the labor market, mostly through the lens of economics, but also borrowing quite a bit from the other social sciences, and providing you with an overview of how labor economists have approached this topic over time, and how past insights shape current perspectives about the remaining gender gaps in the labor market today. So I should mention that much of this work is done in collaboration with Claudia Olivetti and Barbara Petrangelo, and much of the material is actually going to show up in a chapter that we're writing for the Handbook of Labor Economics. So by way of background, one of the more remarkable things that has happened in the labor market over the past half a century has very much been the remarkable progress of women in the labor market. Naturally, alongside these developments has been a very large increase in gender-related topics since the 1990s, which very much culminated in Claudia Goldin winning the Nobel Prize for her work on gender in the economy just last year. So I think so I thought it was very fitting in some way to begin the lecture with a very nice quote from Claudia. And I think, beyond just interest in gender as a topic in its own right, I think it's kind of important to kind of recognize that the study of gender has actually contributed much more generally and significantly to modern labor economics as a whole. So in particular, Claudia says, it would not be too much of an exaggeration to claim that women actually gave birth to modern labor economics, especially the study of labor supply. And in particular, economists typically need variance to analyze changes in behavioral responses. And in many ways, when we think about women's labor supply, women provided an abundance of that. Men, by and large, in many ways, were much less interesting for economists because their participation in hours vary far less in the cross-section and over time. So this figure here, I think, provides you with a bit of a sense of how interest in gender topics, at least within economics, has evolved over time. And in particular, what we do is we plot from the 1970s to the present day, the share of papers in top economics journals on gender-related topics. And by way of comparison, we compare it with the share of papers published on an equally important demographic dimension that many people study, which is race. Just to give you a sense that, really the interest in gender topics has increased very significantly, especially starting in the 1990s. And when you compare it, especially with race, for example, what you notice is that the interest in gender topics seems to, have increased and accelerated at a rate that's much faster than the case for race. Now, you may wonder how we classify these papers. So what we do is essentially we look at titles of journal papers in these economics journals, and we look for the appearance of gender or gender-related words in the title. So, for example, words in the title that speak to female, woman, or gender will be classified as a gender-related paper. Whereas words in the title that say things like race, Black, Hispanic, ethnicity would then be classified as race-related papers. In fact, this conclusion is even stronger when we classify, other words that we think are likely to be gender related, like wife, maternity, mother, or girl. And there you see that, as a share of the total number of papers that are published, those conclusions still hold. Now, you may be curious in terms of topics, what do these gender papers actually study, right? So we know there's an increasing interest in gender topics. What are these papers looking at? So what we do here is something quite similar, but instead we focus within the subset of gender papers that we identified from before. And now we sort papers into different topics by looking at the keywords within the titles. So in particular, we classify papers as being labor-related papers if they have words like earnings, compensation, pay, job, unemployment, employment, and so on and so forth in their title. So we classify that as labor-related papers. And then we go on to classify topics of these papers in a similar way by identifying keywords that suggest that they may be to do with things like family and marriage, education, development, health, behavioral, and so on and so forth. And what you see from this figure is that among gender papers in these top journals, there really, not surprisingly, many of these gender papers are in the areas of traditional, what you might associate as traditional labor topics. So that's given by the blue bars, as well as in topics related to family and marriage. That's given by the red bars. But one thing that you notice is that systematically over time, there has been a decline in these topics to do with traditional labor, family, marriage, education type topics towards papers that study a very broad variety of dimensions, including papers in development, in health, in politics, finance, law, and behavioral economics, such that if you zoom into like the 2020s now, what you see is a much more even distribution of papers across different topics, suggesting very much that the study of gender has expanded from fairly niche topics within labor and family economics to other fields and domains. So the reach of gender, even within economics as a whole, has pervaded other subdisciplines within the field. Now, I think before sort of going into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to just give you a little bit of a sense of what some of the evolving perspectives on gender inequality are, starting in the 1980s towards the present. What you'll notice is that, much of the academic research on this topic has kind of evolved very much alongside empirical developments or real world developments in the labor market. So very often economists would kind of, observe a set of patterns in the data, and then really kind of the research would be very much along the lines of trying to understand how these patterns unfold. So in the 1980s, for example, there were, what we observed in the data were substantial increases in female labor force participation in the 1900s. And as a result, there were, a series of stylized facts on female labor force participation over the life cycle by marital status and presence of children. Now, in the 1990s, a lot of this work shifted toward trying to understand determinants of gender differences in pay and participation, largely through decomposition methods. So some of you guys may have, be familiar with some of these decomposition methods, the most popular of which is the Oaxaca blinder decomposition that tries to take any given observable gap between two groups of people, say an earnings gap, for example, and to try to break it up into a component that is due to an explained component due to differences in characteristics, for example, between men and women, as well as a remaining unexplained component. Now, when one does that exercise on the gender earnings gap, and in a few slides, I will also show you how that looks when we apply it to US data. What we see in the 1990s is that there is a very large role for occupation and industry differences across men and women as key determinants of gender disparities, even after taking into account perhaps that men and women have differences in terms of their human capital investments. Now, whatever is left over typically is something that we will call unexplained. And very often, these unexplained component is sometimes being labeled as discrimination, although they could also be driven by unobserved productivity differences between men and women. So during the 1990s, there was a lot of work in trying to parse out what are some of these key determinants of the gender gaps in pay and participation, with a large focus on trying to understand the role of occupational segregation as well as discrimination. Moreover, in the 1990s, there was also much more recognition that women and men were operating within family units, and that led to a further development of family labor supply models and trying to understand the specialization and allocation of labor within the house. Now, in the 2000s, we observed new and interesting patterns that started to emerge in the data. In particular, what we saw was that between the 80s and the 90s was a period of very rapid convergence in women's labor market outcomes, particularly in terms of labor force participation and earnings. Now, the 2000s came along, and one of the things that economists started to notice in the data is that this convergence, interestingly, started to slow, and on some dimensions actually started to plateau. And this was especially surprising, I think, and constitutes one of the major puzzles that motivates a lot of the research today, because also during this period of time, many countries, including Australia, started to observe what we note as a reversal in the gender gap in education. Notably, the fact that, if you think about gender gaps in education, years of schooling, for example, in the 70s and 80s, that was a situation where typically men would have more years of education than women. However, these gaps narrowed and actually started to reverse starting in the 2000s. So what we had was a situation where convergence in labor market outcomes appeared to have stalled, or maybe in many cases, in some cases, plateaued or maybe even reversed. But this was amidst a backdrop of actually men and women becoming more similar in terms of human capital characteristics like education as well as labor market experience. So what this led to in some way were economists and social scientists trying to look at what we call new classes of explanations for trying to understand these gender differences, right? So we can't now easily rely on differences in education because these gaps have, shrunk and reversed, right? If anything, it's making women look even better. And moreover, this was also during a period of time where there was very active kind of campaigns against discrimination. So we also thought that, in terms of outright discrimination, many of the forms of overt discrimination also appeared to have shrunk, leading economists to start thinking about whether there were other sources of differences that could explain why men and women were performing differently in the labor market. So an especially active area of research, which we will return back to again later in this talk, was this focus on looking at whether or not differences in psychological attributes, traits, or attitudes might explain some of the remaining gender gaps. Now, fast forward to today, I think in the present, what we observe is that these substantial gender gaps in earnings and participation continue to persist. And moreover, many of these gaps, continue to remain quite large, especially at the top of the earnings distribution. Moreover, I think what we see in the data is this very stark pattern, which I will show you in a series of figures, that when we look at when the career trajectories of men and women actually start to diverge, it seems to be very coincident with a very big life-changing event, which is when women have children. So the career declines that women typically face typically surface right around the time that they have kids, suggesting that work-family trade-offs are kind of a very first-order kind of explanation for understanding the remaining gaps. Now, when we start thinking about these work-family trade-offs, then inevitably we have to start thinking of the role of possibly, gender norms and stereotypes as being the root of these differential constraints. Okay, so I promised you some figures to kind of motivate the evolution of academic work on this topic. And so what this figure shows you is quite a standard decomposition of the gender gap in hourly wages over time in the context of the US. And so this is using data from the US between 1980 and 2018, where we take the gender gap in hourly wages and we decompose it into different components that can be explained by possibly differences in educational experience, industry and occupation, background characteristics like race, region, and union status, as well as whatever is left over, which is called the unexplained gap, given in gray. So what you see from the height of the bars here is how the gender gap in hourly wages have evolved over time over the past 5 decades. And what you observe here is that there was indeed a very large decline in the gender pay gap over this period of time, from about 47 log points in 1980 to about 25 log points in 2018, largely driven by a reduction in the residual unexplained gap in the gray bars, but also a decline in educational, occupational, and industry differences. Now, what is more apparent from this figure, as you can see, is that the contribution of education and experience, which is given by the top bars, the blocks on top, that contribution has shrunk a lot. And that's not surprising because we know that now women have caught up with men in terms of education differences. So naturally, they cannot explain much of the remaining gap. In fact, if you see in 2018, they actually explain a negative portion of the gap, suggesting that if anything, actually, the fact that women have more education than men make the gaps look smaller than they really are if you condition on education. The other feature that sort of pops up from this figure is that if you look at present day, as a proportion of the smaller gap, industry and occupation explain an even larger proportion of the overall gap, suggesting that a lot of what is going on seems to be the differential sorting of men and women across different types of occupations and different types of industries. At the same time, there is also still a very large proportion of the gap, 48%, which is unexplained by these observable characteristics, which it would be nice to kind of dig more into to try to understand what goes into that component. So a lot of the recent work today, I think, has really tried to dig a lot more deeply into the lower two blocks, trying to understand what's driving these differences in occupation and industry, and also what's left in the residual. Okay. All right, so in today's talk, what I plan to do is to really provide you with a whirlwind tour of some of the current perspectives on gender inequality, thinking really zeroing in on the roles or preferences versus constraints and its implications for economic efficiency. We will also talk a little bit about some of the causes of the persistent gender gaps that we observe today. And time permitting, we will have a very brief discussion of the policy responses, possible policy responses. Okay, so I think it's good to start with just kind of broadly summarizing where I see current academic thinking as revolving around. And I think when we start thinking about what drives gender differences in the labor market, there are really two fundamentally different explanations for gender gaps. The first is that there are these, what we call essential differences between men and women. And we highlight the word essential because when we say, there are differences between men and women, clearly there are, but when something is essential, it means that these are differences that are kind of inherent in that men and women, for whatever reason, have inherent differences in their preferences, their skills, or their psychological traits that could potentially drive educational choices and labor market outcomes. Now, in that situation whereby the gender differences are actually driven by these inherent differences, in many ways, economists don't have a lot to say about how to then rectify these gender gaps, right? Because they stem from these inherent differences between men and women. And if within those inherent differences, men and women then they make different choices, really gender inequality will really just be a manifestation of these differences. And therefore, there is, and as long as they are, utility maximizing and rational, the fact that they make different choices as a result of these inherent differences in some ways is to be expected. Now, another possibly different explanation for the observed gender gaps, which is very different from this notion of essential differences, is the possibility that men and women are in fact actually similar in relevant dimensions, but face different opportunities and constraints. Now, they could face different opportunities and constraints, perhaps because there are social norms or stereotypes that constrain their behavior, or perhaps there is, forms of discrimination in the labor market that operate as constraints in them trying to realize particular choices that they might like to make. Now, in this situation, then economists have a lot to say about it because gender inequality would then be a symptom of misallocation, in the sense that if you remove these constraints, then men and women would be able to better optimize and allocate their talents more effectively and efficiently in the labor market. Now, when I put these two explanations kind of side by side, it becomes very obvious that they refer to two fundamentally different reasons for the gender gaps. However, the problem is that empirically, it is actually very challenging to separate what is an essential difference from what is a differences because of opportunities and constraints. And this arises largely because when we think about a situation where men and women may differ in a particular skill or a trait, or for that matter, a preference, like say their risk-taking preferences or their preferences for competition or their preferences for, say, looking after children, it is very hard for us to know, just on the basis of observing a difference, whether this difference is actually driven by something innate or essential, or it's driven actually by a response or an internalization of the relevant constraints that person might be facing. So this distinction, I think, between what is an inherent difference that could be driving a difference in preferences versus what is actually something that is more external as a constraint, actually, I think it's something that is very crucial and probably something that wasn't fully appreciated in much of the early literature, but that more recent work has really sought to try to understand better. Okay, so, as we start thinking about these fundamentally different explanations for the gender pay gaps, a very natural question then is, how different are men and women, right? And as it turns out, there is actually a lot of research on this topic, not just by economists. In fact, I would say economists in many ways were very late to the game on this one. And in particular, there has been a lot of research by social psychologists in trying to understand to what extent these inherent or essential differences might actually exist between men and women. So there's a very nice meta-analysis by Hyde in 2014 that basically reviews a very large variety of empirical studies in social psychology, mostly, that look at gender differences in a variety of domains, including differences in cognitive functions, personality traits, as well as certain types of behaviors. And overwhelmingly, I think what has emerged from this literature is that, if anything, there are more similarities between men and women than there are differences. In other words, what Hyde actually concludes from a review of all of these studies is that, in the large majority of domains, in fact, the differences between men and women are actually quite small, or in many cases trivial, especially when it came to things pertaining to, math, verbal skills, some personality traits, as well as leadership effectiveness, for example. And that, if anything, the differences in means between men and women, which we typically focus on, is often swamped by variation within gender, meaning to say there's much more difference across different people within a particular gender than there are in terms of across gender differences in averages. Now, I think these studies are very important because I think what this suggests is that although we are often fixated by small differences in means between both genders, very often these means in itself may not necessarily translate to very large differences in the labor market. There are obviously exceptions to this, and in particular, I think Hyde has highlighted that in some domains, in fact, there are significant gender differences, but these are typically limited to areas to do with spatial ability and interest in things versus people and physical aggression. Now, alongside these developments in the social psychology literature, actually economists have also studied a variety of psychological traits that they thought might account for the differences in men and women sorting the different types of jobs. So these are studies that look at the extent to which men might be more competitive than women, men perhaps prefer more risk-taking behavior than women, or looking at whether or not men and women negotiate at different rates or ask at different rates, or perhaps situations where men may be more overconfident than women. And I think by and large, what these studies find is that, in these domains, there appear to be some gender differences, right? And notice that actually in many of these studies, actually the gender differences in these traits, quote unquote, actually are self-reported differences. And however, when you actually look at a large range of studies that have tried to relate these gender differences on these domains to actual labor market outcomes, so maybe the types of jobs that people sort into, as well as the kinds of earnings that they earn, by and large, it seems that these studies find that gender differences in these psychological traits would account for some, but a rather modest portion of the overall gender pay gap. So, in most cases, either 16% or less. So I think that the overall conclusion, I think, from this this line of work, or at least rather the emerging consensus from this line of work, seems to suggest that actually, if anything, I think these gender differences in psychological attributes probably play at best a modest role in understanding the overall persistent gender gaps. Which brings us to then the idea that perhaps there could be gender differences in constraints. And before I sort of go into more detail into the sources of some of these constraints, I think it's worth pointing out that once we start to accept that, in fact, that there are these gender constraints, then there are actually important allocative efficiency considerations. So one example, right? So if we think, for example, that the distribution of talent does not vary systematically by gender, as suggested by some of the earlier studies, then what this very much suggests is that an economy that taps into a very limited pool of workers to fill prestigious or financially rewarding professions must be operating inefficiently. In other words, one would do better if, in fact, the distribution of talent was more aligned with the distribution of ability, right? So, and you can see that these, the more you select from a very particular group, in this case, possibly men, but in other settings could be also, different ethnic or racial groups for that matter, that in itself is an example where you could have allocative inefficiency. So there's a very nice paper by Cheng Tai-Xie and co-authors that actually, kind of try to back out, how costly in terms of economic efficiency these barriers to entry could be in the economy. And in particular, what they find is that about a quarter of the growth in US GDP between 1960 and 2010 can actually be explained by the fact that there were, significantly declining barriers to entry of women and men in these previously segregated occupations, suggesting that, by maintaining segregated occupations, there was a lot of kind of, like money left on the table. So within this context, then actually gender inequality in itself is actually, economically inefficient. Okay. Other studies have actually studied this from a more micro perspective. And what they typically find is that, there are significant productivity gains from hiring more women and men in some sectors. Consistent with this idea that the present allocation could be potentially inefficient if it is being constrained by if it's being driven by constraints. Okay, so much of the work on gender differences in constraints, therefore, has actually very much emphasized women's primary role as childbearers and carers. So this is again related to what I described before as this. Empirically, what we notice is that there has been this significant decline in women's earnings at the point of childbirth. And in many ways, I think what this literature has sort of come to recognize is that once human capital gaps have closed and in cases actually reversed and outright discrimination has waned, what's left is really mostly about children. And I think in many ways, what we have observed in the literature is a return to more standard sets of explanations that emphasize this trade-off between career and family. There are a number of approaches that economists have taken to try to estimate the impact of children on women's careers. And the most popular one these days have been these event study evidence that maps career trajectories of men and women before and after the birth of the first child. So this is summarized in the figure here. So what we do in this figure is that we use data, again, the US data from the panel study of income dynamics, which follows women and men over a long period of time. And what we do is we plot the earnings of men and women as a function of the years before and after they have a first child. So the vertical line that you see in the figure corresponds to the year just before the birth of the first child. And what you see here is essentially that in the years prior to childbearing, the earnings trajectories of men and women evolve very similarly. And they drop very suddenly after the birth of the first child and remain persistently lower even up to 10 years later in this data. Now, you might wonder why is it that the graphs for men and women track so closely in the year before birth. Some of this is also because we already take out age and life cycle effects. So everything is sort of relative to the year before the birth of the child within gender. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that there are actually some level differences in men's and women's earnings before the birth of the child, but the more significant and larger gaps actually emerge at the point in time where these trajectories diverge, as you see in this figure. Now, in this figure, what you see, the long run penalty in terms of earnings for women is about 40%. And what we see is that actually these patterns are very similar across countries, although the magnitudes of the child penalties differ. They are much smaller in Scandinavian countries and much larger in German-speaking countries like Austria and Germany, but by and large, the qualitative patterns are not too different. Now, you can use some of these event study estimates, like the ones I showed you before, to decompose the overall gender earnings gap into components that are due to background-related inequality, like education and experience, and the proportion that is actually driven by these child-related gender inequality is implied by the figure that you saw before. And what we see here is that today, the proportion of child-related gender inequality has actually risen over time as a proportion of the total gap. And actually today in the US, more than 2/3 of what is left in terms of the overall gender earnings gap is actually driven by child-related gender inequality. Now, so why does this happen, right? So this happens largely because when women and men have children, what we observe is that women typically make significant career adjustments around childbirth. However, we observe that typically men don't make as many adjustments. And in particular, what we see is that new mothers tend to take career breaks, they work fewer hours, and they slip down the occupational ladder. Much of this is because they tend to place a higher value on family-friendly job amenities. And there are a variety of studies that show that women typically have a higher willingness to pay for family-friendly amenities like work flexibility, shorter commutes, and shorter work weeks, which then have earnings implications because to the extent that these amenities are costly for the employer to provide, women are willing to accept a lower pay in order to have access to these amenities. There is also some suggestive work that women may be less productive at work, perhaps because of the loss in labor market experience. And finally, I think a very sort of natural question that comes up from this very often is the extent to which these child penalties are actually driven by biology. So how much of this can actually be accounted for by the fact that women, have to have the child, they, have to breastfeed for a long period of time, and maybe that in itself actually contributes to their greater inability to kind of, return back to the labor market. I think the literature on this actually strongly suggests that actually biology doesn't seem to be the first order determinant of these penalties. And in particular, this conclusion was drawn by a very clever use of looking at how child penalties actually vary in adoptive families, where people get a child but didn't actually give birth to the child. And in those situations, what researchers have found is that the child penalties in the short run are a little smaller, but in the long run, they're actually very similar, suggesting that even in situations where the mothers didn't physically have the child, you still see significant child penalties. And moreover, if you actually look at same-sex couples, where there is a birth mother and a non-birth mother, you actually find that in those cases, actually, the child penalties are much more evenly shared between the birth mother and the non-birth mother, rather than just the birth mother having much larger penalties than the non-birth mother. So I think the combination of these two sets of studies, very much strongly suggests that biology is not the first order driver. Now, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of these considerations, but I think one of the things that we observe as well is that if there are labor markets that are not competitive, many of the explanations that we just described in terms of career-family trade-off can actually be amplified in the sense that employers could actually have monopsony power over groups of workers that might be more constrained in their job search. And so there's an active area of research that is being devoted to that. Now, so this naturally gives rise to this puzzle, right? Why is it that, despite women's economic advancements, work-family issues remain largely a woman's problem? And I think this is where economists have started to take very seriously this notion that gender norms are likely to be one of the major constraints that both women as well as men might face in trying to achieve both career and family. And I think in many ways, the way we think about gender norms is really this idea that if there are identity considerations that apply to engaging in certain types of perhaps gender atypical behavior, this would directly enter into an individual's utility function, and departure from these sorts of prescribed behavior would tend to generate this utility, making groups of people less inclined to engage in that behavior. Now, gender norms are very kind of powerful in the sense that it's a situation where this could be a constraint that actually gets internalized by an individual, thereby affecting, for example, their skill investments and their decisions, as well as potentially their preferences, their attitudes, and their traits. So this is kind of an example of where it might, be endogenous. The kinds of observed differences that we see between men and women that look like differences in preferences could actually be endogenous to the broader set of norms. So there is a large literature that has sought to provide direct tests of the relevance of gender norms for women's relative outcomes in the labor market. They are listed here, but I think by and large, the big takeaway from this literature is that gender norms appear to be first order, and they do seem to be quantitatively relevant in terms of understanding gender gaps in the labor market. So I think one way to illustrate this kind of more concretely is we can take the same child penalty graphs that I showed you before, and we can now disaggregate them into different groups of women, right? Where you can say, let's look at how this child earnings penalty looks like for women who are in families whereby they are more educated than men. They are similarly educated as their husbands, or they're less educated than their husbands. Now, you might say, maybe it's not surprising that, in fact, one of the two people in the couple should slow down when a kid is born because of returns to specialization within the household. Now, if it were purely all driven by specialization, what you should then observe then is that in situations where women are, have higher potential earnings than men, and this will be situations where, for example, a woman is more educated than the husband, given by the green line in this figure, you might have expected that in those cases, the child earnings penalties for women should be smaller, or perhaps even reverse, right? Because in that situation, then clearly if one person has to slow down, it might make more sense for the person with lower potential earnings to actually slow down. But what you see from this figure, by and large, is that there is very little variation across different types of couples by their relative skill in terms of the size of the earnings penalty, suggesting very much that it's not just driven by household specialization and comparative advantage, but it's probably driven by something else, like something like norms, whereby gender roles kind of dictate that it is more often than not the woman that should slow down. So I'm aware that I think we're running out of time. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about some of the possible policy responses, and then really open this up to questions, and then we can sort of dig more deeply into the set of potential policy responses to some of the remaining gaps. So I think, in line with the discussion from before, I think much of the policy responses have actually centered very much around trying to think about how to address these potential work-family trade-offs, either by augmenting work-family amenities, for example, in the form of family policies, trying to equalize childcare by promoting more paternity leave, for example, as well as on the work front, trying to change the structure of work in a way that removes these penalties for engaging in more flexible work. Other kinds of policy responses try to focus on trying to accelerate the adjustments of social norms, some of which actually occur through public policy by trying to equalize or gender neutralize childcare. So I think in my remaining sort of minus 1 minute, I think I'll quickly conclude. So I hope that by the end of this lecture, you've sort of come to a better understanding that I think very much in labor economics or economics as a whole, gender is now very much a mainstream topic. I think much of the recent work on the remaining disparities in the labor market very much center around the tension between work and family, focusing on constraints imposed by social norms as well as how work is organized. I think there are several promising areas of future work. For example, thinking more carefully about the role of firms and whether or not there is this increasing tension between work and family that is starting to take place, whereby work is becoming greedier and the family is also becoming greedier. I think concurrent with all of this is also this notion that if we accept that gender norms are really the root of many of the constraints, how do we actually shift gender norms? What kinds of policies and interventions are effective and why? And I think overall, our strong suspicion is that, to really kind of initiate an effective process for change, this is going to require a combination of efforts and policies to not just weaken traditional gender norms, but also to promote equitable workplaces and practices. So with that, I thank you again for the invitation and also for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really informative talk. So I may take advantage of being the facilitator and ask the first questions. You mentioned that what amenity potentially could facilitate this kind of better so workplace or work-family balance. One thing that kind of come to my mind, for example, would be work from home flexibility to cover work from home or other kind of flexibility. On the first thought, that seems to be great. You can easier to pick up kids. On the other hand, there seems to be some cover stories saying, well, a lot of time and story tend to come from like corporate America, but potentially elsewhere as well, where the lack of in-person socialization, for example, potentially could hinder the career progress of the worker and potentially more for female worker. Do we know, like, is there any kind of a good empirical evidence to help us to think more about what kind of policy potentially could be useful in that regard?
Yeah, no, yeah, thanks, Haishan. I think that's a great question. I think, in many ways, I think when COVID happened and then there was this huge shift towards remote work, I think there was a lot of anticipation, I think, within the economics community that, perhaps this is kind of the long-awaited shock that we've been waiting for, that really kind of shocked the way that we organize work, right? I think so I think there was a lot of sort of early speculation that, to the extent that both men and women, and I emphasize here, right, you really need a situation where both men and women want this amenity. Because if only women want it and it's costly to provide, then we're just back to square one where, women will get the amenity, but then they'll pay for it in terms of lower wages. But if it's a situation where all workers want it, men want it, women want it, and again, the other crucial ingredient is that productivity doesn't suffer, right? Then perhaps we sort of move to a new equilibrium of the way we work. Now, I think, there have been lots of papers, I think, by Nick Bloom and others that really kind of suggest that, in many ways, corporate America seems to be kind of reverting back to, perhaps some degree of work from home, but by and large, emphasizing this in-person interaction. Suggesting perhaps that I think that there are some papers that suggest, for example, perhaps that there are indeed productivity consequences of working from home. And moreover, that, even when you work from home, are these productivity differences similar by gender? I think it's not obvious, right? Because when, for example, a man works from home, perhaps there is it sends a signal to the employer that, he's working, quietly in his room. Whereas when a woman does work from home, the idea is that she might be actually, getting groceries, picking up the child, doing the bulk of childcare while she's doing it. So I think this is probably the challenge. And I would say, I think the research is still very, new on this. In terms of really trying to understand whether there are situations where this has been used effectively to try to level the playing field for men and women within jobs. So, yeah. So I would say the verdict's still out. Yeah.
Okay. Good news for labor economists. That means that more research could be done. Exciting research. We'll have a few questions coming in. Let's see. Oh, Todd asked. Well, Todd said first. Todd Morris, our colleague, great lecture. He asked, could you what can we say about the impact of declining female fertility rates? On the one hand, this should reduce the gender earning gap, particularly if there are fewer women having children. But it's less clear if it's more about the number of children women are having. Is there evidence about this?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. Actually, fertility, I think, is very linked to all of this in a variety of ways. I think on the one hand, it is true that there are declining fertility rates, but I think by and large, on the extensive margin, I think, there are still a lot of women who do have children. And in particular, I think governments are trying to encourage women to, families to have at least one child. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the earnings penalties that I showed you before, it's not a question of how many children you have. In fact, you see the effects actually kind of come in at the birth of the first child. There are additional kind of penalties associated with the second and the third child, but that actually tends to be much smaller relative to the effect on the first child. Now, I would say, though, I think the reaction of having lower fertility, or, I think in some parts of the world, we actually observe, for example, educated women, deciding to opt out from marriage, in some way could be exactly a reaction to these anticipated career-family trade-offs. So the low fertility in itself actually could be an outcome of the kinds of tensions that we were describing in such a way that it kind of just leads families to move away from having children. My last point that I wanted to make about fertility is that I think just because the number of children has declined doesn't necessarily mean that people spend less time with children. In fact, one of the things that we notice in the data is that if anything, families, both mothers and fathers, but mothers to a larger extent, are actually spending even more time than ever with their children, despite the fact that, many of these are highly educated families who can afford outsourcing childcare. I think partly because, maybe there is this idea that inequality has risen and therefore competition is tougher. Or maybe because now you only have one child, so it's all eggs in one basket, right? If you had three, maybe, one of the three is going to turn out fine. But if you only have one, then you cannot afford to fail. That child better, do well. And so I think there are some implications on this for even thinking about parental investments, quality, quantity kind of trade-offs.
Great. Thanks. We have another question, which is asking about how the gender difference in economic academia is shaped.
I think in terms of I think like in many other professions, I think there are definitely differences. In terms of I think there are well-known differences in terms of likelihood of succeeding in graduate school, for that matter, succeeding in academia within gender. I think this varies quite a bit across the different subdisciplines. I think, naturally you might see women gravitating towards one subfield more than the other. But I think by and large, I would imagine that I think a lot of this also, are, kind of men and women responding to incentives. And also this idea that I think, given the sort of very particular incentive structure in academia, more broadly speaking, I think it does in some way make kind of this career family trade-off sometimes even more apparent for women than for men. So I think there's been a lot of discussion about whether some of the gender neutral kind of policy rules in academia really are they truly gender neutral, or do they actually implicitly favor one gender over the other? And in particular, I'm referring to, for example, this idea of having a tenure clock kind of what you call it, suspension, right, for having a child. I think there have been some studies that suggest that although this is a something that's gender neutral, it's applied equally to both men and women. In some way, it could actually, if you think that there are differential kind of costs for women engaging in childcare, a gender neutral policy could actually have some gender implications.
I have another question from KK. Asking, is there any evidence on impact of having children on the earning of male same-sex couple versus female same-sex couple?
Yeah. So thanks for that question. So that's a really good, nice question. So unfortunately, I think a lot of the research, so the research has looked at same-sex couples, because I think they provide a very interesting different dimension when we start thinking about gender roles, right? Because the notion of gender is a little bit different in that context because they're same-sex couples. Unfortunately, there aren't enough male same-sex couples in many of the studies to be able to kind of look at the child earnings penalties within male same-sex couples. So that part I think is still open, and it'll be interesting to study. However, they have looked at female same-sex couples, and what they have observed is that in those situations, there is typically an earnings penalty as well for the birth mother that appears shortly after the child is born, but the overall earnings penalties are actually lower for both birth mother and the non-birth mother, in part because they share the penalties more evenly. So the relative gap within the household post-birth in a female same-sex couple is significantly lower or smaller than in a heterosexual couple. And I think this is taken as evidence to suggest that there is something about gender roles that's going on, and not just about this, it's not just driven by, the fact that the woman had a child, because even within female same-sex couples, one of them had the child, and yet her penalty is very similar to her partner's, probably because they share the caregiving roles much more, neutrally.
Thanks. So one question that I got, it has two parts. The first part is about what are the pros of the social norms for women taking leave to care for children. The second part maybe will take longer because it's involving Australia's pension system. but maybe we'll just begin with the first one.
Sure. I don't know enough about superannuation, so I'm not going to even try to hazard a guess. But so I think the question is, what are the pros of social norms within women taking leave to care for children? So I think it's not so much about whether it's good or bad for women to do something. I think the broader question is to the extent that I think if there were no constraints and men and women could make choices about what they feel is the best way that they would like to spend their time to maximize the utility of their household, for example, I think whatever outcome they choose is going to be welfare maximizing. And there will be certain couples whereby the woman will feel that they perhaps have a comparative advantage in childcare and therefore they want to take on that role. And there will be certain situations where maybe perhaps men might feel that they have the comparative advantage in childcare and they want to take on that role. I think what we observe today, unfortunately, is a situation where gender norms seem to constrain the set of choices that men and women can make, such that it pushes them towards making certain sets of choices that seem to corroborate the norm. So I think, I know my answer to this is not very direct, because I don't think one can say that, it's good or bad. But I think what's important is that, to the extent that people can make unfettered choices, I think that's what we are trying to go toward. Yeah.
Great. So one last question that's kind of related, but I'm not sure whether we have enough time, is that what would be the how childcare related to, I suppose that to some extent it could relax some of those constraints, but I'm not sure. Is there anything you can
absolutely
say
so
quickly?
So I appreciate the question, because I think it gives me a chance to talk about one of the slides that I had to skip over in the interest of time. So I think I think Emma is perfectly I think the question was perfectly spot on to suggest that, in fact, I think one of the ways in which policy has tried to tackle this issue of work-family trade-offs is really to try to is to really try to provide family-friendly policies in the form of what I call outsourcing childcare, right? So this could perhaps be in the form of, having, better preschools, cheaper preschools, maybe more flexible opportunities to get help with childcare. And given how, costly childcare appears to be, I think what the studies have generally found is that in some situations, subsidized childcare does increase female labor force participation and earnings, especially among low-skilled women. But I think these effects actually start getting a lot smaller, I think, once you get into countries whereby labor force participation is quite high, or the coverage of these childcare policies are already quite generous. I think it's not surprising in some sense that when you have market substitutes for household production, you would get some effect on women's better ability to combine both work and family. I think the challenge here is how far this can go, right? Meaning to say, I think there are definitely limited gains to supply side policies. If children are time consuming, we see people spending even more time with children, even when they can afford to outsource. And so if the aim is really to contract out all of childcare, then the question is, why do people have kids, right? So I think this on the margin will help some women, and it's very necessary as a base. But I think to really try to close the overall gaps, there has to be more than supply side policy. It cannot just be that we try to outsource everything, because that clearly isn't going to work, right? Because people don't want to, actually, because you observe them spending a lot of time with children still.
Right. So actually we have quite a number of questions, but I think I'm afraid we are running out of time. Please join me to thank Professor Jessica Pan to give us this informative, exciting, and stimulating lecture. The recording, I think if you register, will be sent later on. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Haishan, and thank you, everyone.